between shooting these videos off camera, we were just talking about how it seems in church history, we have these great saints, often males, priests, bishops, religious, who lay down this thick level of concrete, this theology. And then along with them come these beautiful female saints who adapt and transform that theology into something rich and personal and spiritual. We see that with Anselm and Bernard, and then St. Hildegard. We see that with Francis and Clare. We see it with Dominic and Thomas Aquinas, and then with St. Catherine of Siena. And we just looked at St. Teresa of Avila, and we move now to sort of her theological twin, her pair, St. John of the Cross, the great Carmelite reformer and mystical theologian. John of the Cross was born in 1542 near Avila into a family of Jewish converts to Catholicism. We saw this with St. Teresa of Avila, who also came from Jewish stock. We find the same thing here with John of the Cross. In 1545, when he's about 3 years old, his father died and his family fell into poverty. His older brother Louis died shortly after. And so for the next several years during his childhood, his mother moves from town to town looking for work as a weaver. In 1559 to 1563, this is ages 17 to 21 for John, he studies at a Jesuit school recently established by St. Ignatius of Loyola. So thank you, St. Ignatius of Loyola, for providing a way for John of the Cross to be educated. And in 1563, at age 21, after his education, he enters the Carmelite order with the name, not John of the Cross. His original religious name was John of St. Matthias, the apostle who replaced Judas Iscariot. The next year, when he's 22 years old, he begins his study at the University of Salamanca under the famed biblical scholar Louis of Lyon. Also at this time, the University of Salamanca had some great Thomistic philosophers in theology, which was another positive influence on the young John of the Cross. In 1567, at the age of 25, he was ordained a priest, and he planned to transfer out of the Carmelites because he thought they were too lax, a similar complaint that St. Teresa of Avila had during this time, and he wanted to join the stricter religious order of the Carthusians. But at this time, while he was wanting to transfer from the Carmelites into the Carthusians, he met a charismatic nun by the name of Teresa of Avila. She persuaded him to stay in the Carmelite order and to reform it with her by returning to the primitive rule of 1209. Now, this primitive rule, as we discussed in the previous lesson in Teresa of Avila, included things like no meat from the Feast of the Holy Cross, September 14th, till Easter, silence between Compline and Prime, coarse, rough habits, no shoes, only sandals, that's why it's called discalced, divine office in choir. In 1568, at the age of 26, he helps begin the first discalced Carmelite friary for men. And he changes his religious name at this moment from John of St. Matthias to John of the Cross, to signify that he's going deeper in his suffering, deeper in his conversion. He's turning now to the cross. In 1571 to 1577, so this is ages 29 to 35, he becomes a spiritual director to St. Teresa and her nuns. And it's during this time, as we mentioned in the previous lesson, that this Reformed Carmelite movement falls under suspicion and persecution. It's during this point in his life, John received a mystical vision of Christ crucified, as he says, from above. And he sketched it out. You can see this sketch on the screen right now. It shows Christ crucified as if God the Father was looking down upon him as a perfect sacrifice. This same sketch that John of the Cross made inspired a similar version that was composed by Salvador Dali in 1951, which Salvador Dali named Christ of St. John of the Cross. You can see that on the screen too, the comparison between the original one by John of the Cross in the 1500s and then the modified version of Salvador Dali in 1951. At age 34, John is imprisoned in Medina by Carmelite friars, his own brothers, who were opposed to his reform. However, the nuncio intervened and he was freed. The next year in 1577, John is imprisoned yet again by Carmelite friars who are opposed to his strict, austere reforms of the Carmelite order. He's placed in a cell that's 10 by 6 feet. He is whipped, he is lashed publicly every single week by his Carmelite brothers. He can only eat bread, water, and salted fish. And after being imprisoned like this, after 9 months, he pries the door of his cell open and escapes through a window on the feast of the Assumption of Mary, August 15th. 2 years later, he's appointed rector of the Collegio de San Basilio. And in 1580, when he's 38, Pope Gregor XIII finally approves and vindicates the Discalcid Carmelite reform, thereby vindicating what he's doing amongst the men and what Teresa of Avila is doing amongst the nuns. At age 40, Teresa of Avila, his mentor, his inspiration, dies at the age of 67. And in 1585, at age 43, he's elected provincial vicar of the Discalcid Carmelites in Andalusia. In 1588, he's elected third counselor to the Vicar General of the Discalcid Carmelites, Nicholas Doria. However, he and Doria have a disagreement. And so John of the Cross is sent into isolation in Andalusia, where he dies of St. Anthony's fire. This is a strep infection of the skin, a very painful way to meet your end and to die. And he was canonized in 1726 by Pope Benedict XIII and declared a doctor of the church in 1926 by Pius XI after the consultation of Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, one of my favorite philosophers and theologians, because he combines this mystical theology of the Carmelites with the theology of Thomas Aquinas. So there's the life of St. John of the Cross. Let's look at his writings and his mystical theology. John of the Cross wrote the Spiritual Canticle, and this is sort of a poetic, flowing revision or rewrite of the Song of Songs, where the bride is seeking to find her beloved groom. The bride, of course, is the soul. The groom is Jesus Christ. This continues this mystical tradition that starts with Bernard of Clairvaux. Actually, it goes back to the Jewish days, but with Bernard of Clairvaux, Thomas Aquinas, Teresa of Avila, seeing the Song of Songs, the Canticle of Canticles, as this great source of mysticism, bridal mysticism. He also writes his famous work, The Dark Night of the Soul. And this describes the pain of the soul as it detaches from the world, from the senses, and finds its union with God. And this builds on the theme of St. Teresa of Avila, that the painful way of union is somehow good and even pleasurable, that pain can be pleasurable, just as she experienced that deep pain of the angel, the seraph, driving a fiery dart in and out of her heart. The pain overwhelmed her, and yet it brought her great consolation and goodness. Both of these works, the Spiritual Canticle and the Dark Night of the Soul, are considered masterpieces by Spanish scholars, both secular and religious scholars. This is the beginning of great Spanish literature in the 1500s. He also wrote The Ascent of Mount Carmel, and it's a more systematic commentary on the themes of union found within the Dark Night of the Soul, which itself is a little bit more poetic. Now, John's studies at Salamanca as a young man would have given him a deeply Thomistic theology, because as I said before, Salamanca was a place where Thomist scholars gathered and where he had solid biblical scholarship under Louis of Lyon. And through Thomas Aquinas, John of the Cross was exposed to the mystical Eastern theology of Dionysius the Areopagite, which is based on the threefold conversion of purification, illumination, and union with God. And John of the Cross blends this systematic theology of Thomas Aquinas with the mysticism of his mentor, St. Teresa of Avila. As I mentioned in the previous lesson on St. Teresa of Avila, I call this personalized scholasticism. It's taking the raw, strong theology of Thomas Aquinas and placing it into this very emotional, effective, we might even say in the right terms, an erotic relationship between the soul as bride and Christ as the groom. And once again, I would encourage you to investigate not only the writings of Teresa of Avila, her interior castle, and of John the Cross, especially his Dark Night of the Soul, but also to seek out a more contemporary take on these great mystics, and that is Father Reginald Garrigou Lagrange. He has a short version, 3 conversions. He also has a longer version, which is more like 1,600 pages on the 3 ages. Garrigou Lagrange is a Dominican, he's a Thomist, but he's taking this deep Carmelite theology and he's showing how it's completely compatible with what Thomas Aquinas is doing. And here at the New St. Thomas Institute, I think what Garrigou Lagrange gave the church in the 1900s is something that we at the New St. Thomas Institute should be deeply excited about, because it shows that the theology of Aquinas, scholasticism, leads to personal sanctity and conversion and a great vocation to go out into the world and to share the love of Jesus Christ. So there he is, St. John of the Cross, a great mystic, a great theologian. May he pray with us, and may you be blessed until our next lesson. Thanks for being a member, and we'll see you next time. God bless.